the term muddy color even refer to exactly, and more importantly, how can these be avoided when painting with watercolor? Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're having a beautiful and super inspiring day, and thank you so much for joining me today for another art video. Today, I'm going to be explaining what the term muddy color refers to, and I'm going to be sharing my favorite tips that I always make sure to apply myself when painting with watercolor in order to avoid them. Alright, so while I'm talking about muddy colors, I'm going to be sharing my watercolor painting process for a simple landscape that I worked on a couple of weeks ago. As throughout this painting process, I make use of most of the tips that I'm going to be sharing with you in the second part of this video. Before getting into any sort of tip in order to avoid muddy colors, I want to explain what this term refers to because it can really mean different things to different artists. And I have found this especially to be the case when painting with watercolor because we're working on paper, which can be very easily damaged. We can just very easily overwork our painting. And there are also other ways in which this medium is very different from painting with things like acrylics or oils or even gouache, because this medium is translucent and it really lends itself to create light paintings that seem to glow from within. And lots of artists use all of watercolor's inherent characteristics to create a beautiful, vibrant, interesting use of color, and really aim to stay away from any sort of dullness or flatness or heaviness. And aside from all of this, of course, there's also the fact that when we're painting with watercolor, there is no way to fix a mistake easily or cover it up with a layer of paint like we can do when we're painting with something like acrylics or oils. So because of these things, it's no surprise really that we're constantly hearing people talk about how muddy colors are bad and how we should be avoiding them when painting with watercolor. Having said all of this, it's important to take into account that different artists have different ways of doing things and are looking for different kinds of outcomes. Even though some watercolor artists may be looking for very vibrant and saturated color, there are other artists who intentionally mute out their color mixtures to make them look more natural. And this is exactly a point that I wanted to highlight here. If as an artist you're working on a piece and you're intentionally trying to do something, whether it's creating a certain type of mark or a certain type of color, whatever it is, if you're intentionally trying to do that because it's what's going to help you create that final outcome that you're looking for, then there is no problem with you creating that more muted out, desaturated looking color if that's what you're going for. The problem is when we create these colors that we weren't looking for because we are losing control about our color, not staying mindful throughout the process, trying to rush things or fussing too much over little accidents or things that happen naturally, etc. I definitely have artist friends that work with watercolor and enjoy keeping their color mixing palette dirty and mixing these different colors together, and they're able to arrive at a great looking outcome that is still playing with watercolor's translucency, but most of the time they're using more natural, darker colors that are a little bit more realistic, and they're not really intending to go for very vibrant, in your face use of color, if that makes any sense. This said, they have gained mastery of their medium. They also have great knowledge of the color wheel. They know what's going to happen when different colors intermix. And almost always, they have actually prepared this color palette to work from that includes their specific color choices. They're not working from a pre-made set of watercolors or anything like that, but they've actually prepared specific colors to work with. In many cases, when the artist is trying to achieve very high levels of realism, doesn't matter what kind of painting medium he or she is using, they intentionally desaturate their colors with a complementary color. We're going to talk about that in just a bit, but what's important to remember is that in nature, there are not very many highly saturated, vibrant colors. Maybe some flowers are very bright and vibrant, and maybe there are certain plants that have very bright, vibrant greens. But even in those cases, those petals of those flowers have other more muted out colors in them, and the same thing happens with those brightly colored green stems and leaves. These bright colors are surrounded by more desaturated, muted colors that are more natural looking. All in all, in our everyday life, most colors of the objects and the subjects around us are not very saturated, not very vibrant. Most colors straight out of the pan or tube, you're gonna notice, are super bright, super vivid, super saturated, not too natural, unless of course you're looking at a brown, at a neutral. There are certain greens that are way more natural looking than others, but all in all, colors straight out of the pan or tube are very, very saturated and not very natural. If someone is trying to paint something like a very realistic looking portrait, skin color is desaturated, hair color is desaturated. And so the artist is going to have to mix colors together, because those pure colors straight out of the pan or tube are probably going to have to be toned down. So once again, desaturated colors or even muted out colors are not necessarily bad if you actually planned for them, if you intentionally created them, if they fit within the context of your painting and your style. So because of all of this, I wouldn't consider a muted out, desaturated color muddy necessarily. What I personally consider mud is when a color mixture or a section of our painting has turned completely dull and flat and lifeless. All right, so here are the two common definitions of muddy colors that I have come across. I am sure there are more, but these are the main ones that I have heard artists talk about in the past and that have made sense with my own experience when painting with this medium. The first one is when our color mixtures, whether they are on our color mixing palette still or whether they are already on our watercolor paper, look very grayish, very brownish, and very desaturated, and or these colors simply don't look like they belong within the context of the rest of our painting when compared to the other colors that we've used around them. And another explanation for muddy colors, and this is especially the case when painting with this particular medium, is when we create dull, matte, flat colors that have no vibrancy to them. And this happens a lot when we overwork our painting, when we go in and fuss way too much over our washes of color or simply start stacking layers of color on top of each other without allowing layers to dry in between or making sure that we are dropping in our color at the right point in time when our paper is in the right level of wetness. But even when our paper is at the right level of wetness, we shouldn't be mindlessly dropping in all sorts of different colors on top of each other. So that's basically what a muddy color refers to when painting with watercolor. And now I want to move on to explaining why these things tend to happen. Most of the times, muddy colors tend to happen because of one or more of the following things. Number one, they happen because of a lack of control of our different colors on our paint mixing palette or on our paper. Number two, we don't have much knowledge of the color wheel and color mixing, and we don't take time to pre-select our colors or to test out our color mixtures on a scrap piece of paper before actually using them. Number three, we're not completely cleaning out our paintbrush bristles before jumping into a new color that we're gonna be using. And or we're not changing our dirty, murky water. And finally, another reason is we are getting very impatient. We're not staying mindful throughout the process. We're rushing things. And we forget that we're working ultimately on paper, which is fragile while it's wet, and we go over the same spot again and again and again in efforts to fix what we consider to be mistakes, but ultimately we tend to make matters worse, creating muddy colors and at times even damaging our paper. All right, so let's get into the practical tips that I want to share with you guys in order to avoid muddy colors in the future. But before I get into that, I want to send out a huge warm welcome to everyone that is just visiting my channel today for the very first time. Welcome, and I am so happy that you're here. Do consider subscribing because I share new videos every single week, and I would love to have you here and be part of this growing art community. The very first tip is going to be to learn about the color wheel and color temperature and practice creating your own color mixtures and getting comfortable with that outside of an actual painting process. Do things like color wheel exercises and creating color mixtures with warm biased colors versus cool biased colors versus combining the two and seeing what happens firsthand. That is the best way that you're gonna get that knowledge stuck in your head, and you're gonna be able to make use of this when you're actually creating a painting. Combining warm colors together versus cool colors together and a warm and a cool can lead to very different effects. Tip number 2 is going to be something that I shared in a previous video here on YouTube, and this is to actually give thought to the colors that you're going to be using for the painting on hand instead of randomly picking colors throughout the process. This is especially helpful when you're just getting started because you can separate those colors or take note of the specific colors that you're going to be using and not randomly pick colors throughout the process, because that is a surefire way of arriving at muddy colors, just randomly grabbing colors throughout the process. As I was mentioning before, when you're looking at a video tutorial created by a highly skilled watercolor artist and you're seeing this huge paint mixing palette and the artist looks like he or she is very freely grabbing different colors and mixing them together, what I was mentioning before comes into play. Not only have they already mastered the medium and know about water control and how to clean out their paintbrush bristles between colors and all of that, he or she already knows about the color wheel. They know what is going to happen when different colors intermix. And most likely than not, that color palette that you see laid out, even though it looks messy to you, they have pre-selected those colors and prepared that color palette for themselves with the colors that they already know and love using. I would highly recommend keeping your color scheme limited and really testing out your different colors and color mixtures before getting started with the painting process. Think of how you're gonna be darkening values and creating the different colors that you need using a limited amount of colors. I have shared YouTube videos in the past in which I create a complete painting using 4, 5, 6 different colors, and that's it. As you're choosing your colors for a new piece, remember that if you're intending to mix a couple of colors together and one of these two colors has a lot of another color in it, then you're actually mixing 3 colors together and not 2. So let's say that you're trying to create a purple, right? So red plus blue equals purple. But if you grab one of those blues that has a lot of green in it, because in watercolor sets there tend to be several different blues that have some green in them and vice versa, lots of greens have a lot of blue in them, then you're actually going to be mixing 3 colors together and not 2. And that's going to have a great effect on the turnout of your color mixture. If you're gonna be mixing colors together, try to create your color mixtures with 2, maximum 3 different colors, unless you really know what you're doing. And this can even happen unintentionally, because if you're not washing out your paintbrush bristles correctly, you can still have another color in them that can affect your color mixtures. Remember that every time you add another color into your color mixtures, you further reduce its saturation and its purity more and more the more colors you add in. I really enjoy using a limited color scheme for my paintings myself because it tends to create a very harmonious, pleasing looking painting. Plus, using a limited color scheme is going to allow you, more likely than not, to keep things more organized on your paint mixing palette, which is another factor why we tend to create muddy colors. We lose control of our color mixtures. Tip number 3 is going to be to make sure that you are changing your water as soon as it starts becoming murky. You can even make use of 2 or even 3 different containers of water to clean out your paintbrush bristles in one of them, and make sure that you have a separate container with clean water at all times for whenever you need to add more water into your color mixtures or just dampen your paintbrush bristles again to go back into your painting whenever you need to soften edges or anything like that. The next tip is to make sure that you are thoroughly cleaning out your paintbrush bristles between your colors, especially if you're using a very different color from the one that you were previously using. So let's say that you are using an orange and you're gonna switch to painting a blue sky. You definitely want to clean out your paintbrush bristles thoroughly, because those are complementary colors, and complementary colors lead to brownish desaturated colors. Which leads me to the next tip, and this is to be careful when you're mixing complementary colors together. Complementary colors are opposite colors in the color wheel, and they basically neutralize or mute each other out. All you need to do to mute a color out is add a little bit of its complementary color into it. So if you want to do this intentionally, then awesome. If you're trying to keep your colors vibrant and saturated, then you probably want to stay away from having your color intermix with its complementary. When I have to create a darker color mixture of a specific color that I am using for my painting, and it makes sense with the subject that I am painting, of course, and I want that color to remain vibrant, then what I do is I add a bit of an analogous color to the color that I am using. Adding a cool biased analogous color into your mixture tends to lead to very vibrant results. Analogous colors are colors that are next to each other in the color wheel. So if I am using a purple and I want to darken that purple while keeping it very vibrant, then I could just add some blue into the purple. Another tip is to stay away from using ready-made blacks, such as lamp black, Mars black, ivory black, etc., because these tend to be very dull. They tend to muddy up and dirty up our vibrant colors, basically. And I have created a couple of videos on why I stay away from using ready-made blacks, which I'm going to make sure to leave down below in the description box of this video in case you want to go and check those out. Many times, if I want to create a very dark version of a color, I add either Payne's Gray into it, because Payne's Gray is a color that in many watercolor sets, this is a combination of ivory black plus blue. So at least it has a color temperature to it and it's not completely dull and flat. In other cases, I add something like neutral tint into my color mixture. But blacks, I really tend to stay away from. The next tip is going to be to really hold yourself back from going in and overworking your painting. With watercolor, it's definitely a balance between visualizing and using the techniques that are going to likely lead to the effect that you want via wet on wet techniques, wet on dry techniques, etc. But at the same time, allow the paint to do its own thing. And this is something that I am working on myself as I keep developing my watercolor painting skills, but I am really working on placing those washes or that paint confidently and just leaving that be. And even if I make a mistake, a lot of the time what I do is I just pick up that excess water and paint from my paper, I allow it to dry completely, and I make a mental note to go back in later to see how I can make that mistake less noticeable, because I know that 90% of the time, if I go immediately into my painting after having done that mistake and start fussing over it, I'm gonna make the matter worse. And it's just going to be a lot better if I allow it to dry and come back into that later to see how I can fix it. And the next tip is going to be to make sure that you are allowing your layers of color to dry in between completely before attempting to create another wash of color on top. Also remember that watercolors are always going to expand or bleed into wet or damp paper. It's gonna do it more or quicker if you're dropping it into a very wet paper, and it's gonna expand less if the paper is starting to dry. So in other words, if we drop in a color on a layer of paint that is still wet, and these two colors are very different to each other, maybe complementaries in the color wheel, then we may end up with a grayish brownish color that we weren't intending to create because these colors are going to intermix. So it's very important to visualize what we're intending to do and to at least have a general plan of how we're going to be moving forward and what techniques we're going to be using, whether wet on wet or wet on dry, depending on what we're going for, so that we can make sure that we're moving forward in a way that makes sense. The next tip is going to be to avoid using colors that are more opaque, such as cadmium yellow, cadmium red, cerulean blue, raw umber, yellow ochre, etc. And if you are going to use them, just use them very carefully. So when we're using watercolor, each pigment or each color, even within the same set of colors, has different characteristics. They react differently when we're painting with them, and they tend to lead to different results. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important to swatch out your colors when you buy a new set of watercolors, especially because the colors can really vary from brand to brand. So it's important to know that certain colors are a little bit more opaque than others. Colors can be opaque, semi-opaque, transparent, and semi-transparent. And the more opaque they are, the more likely they are to create mud if you mix them together with another color. Opaque colors tend to create color mixtures that get thicker and thicker and murkier and murkier. This doesn't mean that you can't use them, just consider using them on their own as opposed to combining them with another color or allowing that layer to dry completely before placing another wash on top of them. On the other hand, there are more transparent colors such as phthalo blue, quinacridones, Hanzas, etc., which don't tend to create mud because they're transparent. All right, moving on to the very last tip for today, tip number 10. And this is to make sure that you are cleaning out your paint mixing palette. If you find you're having trouble with muddy colors, make sure that you're cleaning everything out. And as I was mentioning before, keep your colors organized as much as possible throughout the process. You can also consider investing in a paint mixing palette like mine with higher walls in between the wells so that your paint mixtures don't intermix and you have more control. As a bonus tip, and this isn't as much a tip as it is just something to have in mind, is that higher quality paint is going to tend to lead to better results. Cheaper watercolor paint really tends to be made out of less than stellar binder and color. A lot of the times, many colors are very chalky and opaque. And something else to consider is that higher quality paint comes with more information about each and every color inside of the set. They usually tell you if a paint is transparent, opaque, or somewhere in between, whether it's light, fast, etc. And all of this just helps you make better choices when you're painting. And there are definitely great brands out there such as Winsor & Newton, St. Petersburg, and also Van Gogh that offer great quality for an accessible price. Alright everyone, that is going to do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it, that you learned something new, or that you found it inspiring. If you did like it, please make sure to give this video a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and allows more artists to get to know about my channel. Thank you so very much for watching today. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments for me, make sure to leave them down below in the comment section. I always love hearing from you guys and read every single one of your comments. Don't forget to subscribe so that I can see you next week for another video, and stay inspired. Bye guys!